Hello, everybody. This is Maurice Kempner. I'm an attorney, real estate broker, coach, and consultant. Welcome to True Legacy Wealth Media. So, today we're going to talk about equity. So, what I mean by equity here is the ownership interest you have in something. So, equity in real estate is a typical example, equity in your home, right? So, let's just talk about that. There's a certain principle that I want you to learn about equity. I think it's something that once you understand it, it'll be quite an epiphany if you don't already understand it. And it has to do with how equity works, how it maintains value or loses value or whatever. There's just a characteristic of equity that I want you to know and understand. And you need to know this for business and family and multi-generational wealth purposes. Okay? So let's say you got two people and they come and they buy a house in a neighborhood and they buy the exact same house. They live across the street from each other. And let's say these houses are $500,000 each. One person goes and they put 500,000, they just pay $500,000 in cash for their house. So they have $500,000 of equity in the house because they just paid for it, right? The other guy across the street, he doesn't do that. He takes out a loan for $500,000 and doesn't have any equity. Now, let's say over a period of time, whatever period of time it could be, 10 years, 5 years, whatever, the value of these homes double in value. So now each home is worth $1 million. Each home is worth $1 million. Now, the guy who has no equity in his house, the value of his home increased by $500,000. The person who had $500,000 of equity now has $1 million of equity because their house increased $500,000 in value. So let's say the guy who took out a loan, just to illustrate how this works, just to make it simple, let's just say he had an interest only loan. So he didn't pay down any principal. So he still owes the 500,000 he originally owned, right? And he's made all these interest payments during the time. Well, now he has $500,000 of equity in his home because the home went up $500,000 in value. The guy who paid for his home has $1 million in equity, right? But I want to point out this thing. There is this principle. It's a major thing you need to understand. There's no return on equity. So the guy who had no equity in his home made $500,000 in equity on his home, just like the guy who had his house paid off. They both made the same amount of money. So the increase in the value of the property has nothing to do with the equity. Now, let's say this had taken place where it doubled over 10 years. Well, what happens to the value of that equity in the home? If you put $500,000 into the purchase of that home and just owned it and had $500,000 of equity, do you think that $500,000 is worth the same 10 years later? It's not. It's a huge loss in purchasing power and value of that equity over that period of time. So you can look this up over about the last 20 years or so. The dollar in the United States, for example, and you could look this up with any currency wherever you live, whatever currency you use, it's lost about 20% of its or 40% of its buying power over the last 20 years. So if you had equity in a property 20 years ago, this equity that you had then, maybe the property went up in value, but the original equity you had, it's lost about 40% of its value over the last 20 years, approximately. That's the principle I want you to learn. So anytime you have equity sitting there, it's like cash um, in a mattress. It just goes down in value over time. Now, there are some things you can do about that, and those are for other videos. But right now, in conclusion, the principle I want you to take away is that equity is like cash. It goes down in value over time. And that in almost every case, equity has nothing to do with the rate of return or the return you make on anything. The equity in it doesn't have anything to do with it. It's market forces or whatever that asset is, be it real estate, securities, whatever. The equity in them has nothing to do with whether how much your rate of return is going to be. And so profit overall is not based on equity. There is no profit in it. Um, and there are things you can do about this to minimize those losses. And I'm not saying, in conclusion here, I'm not saying that you should never have equity or you shouldn't pay off your home. In some cases it makes a lot of sense. In other cases it doesn't. But I just want you to be aware. This is the bottom line here: is when you have equity and it's just sitting there, it's losing value. Okay, and any increase in value you have has nothing to do with the equity.